It began as a freak snowstorm. I've been hiking and camping in the woods outside of Kashmir since I was in high school. It was a spot I used to like to come to with my friends before they all got too busy to return to nature every now and again. The wilderness in North Georgia is just so beautiful. It's a great place to immerse yourself in nature and return to your roots. This weekend, however, I found myself at nature's mercy instead of its beauty. Well, maybe not nature. The longer I stay here, the more I suspect that something insidious might be in this place. When I set up my tent Friday afternoon, the temperature had been a little crisp, but nothing out of the ordinary. Spring has been in bloom, and it seemed unthinkable that it could get below 50 in the daytime. I had been meaning to hike deeper, coming back out again on Sunday, but when I woke up to find snow, I decided my weekend might be a bust. After gathering the gear I could find, I began hiking back to my truck. But I must have gotten turned around. As the day fretted out, I realized how lost I'd become. My usual landmarks were either covered in snow or changed so drastically that I didn't even recognize them. My compass was no help. The needle kept turning and turning, leading me in circles as I wandered through the snow. As I got more and more turned around, the night began to creep up on me. I was soon watching the sunset as I thought about whether or not to put up my tent or keep walking. And that was when I saw the light. It was small, like a candle on a windowsill. I'd never seen any houses out in the woods before, but it was possible that someone had built one in the 6 or 8 months since I had last been out here. I began heading in that direction, and as I did, I saw a cabin begin to materialize amidst the snow. A candle was burning on the windowsill, and as I approached, I began to look for signs of life. I saw no four-wheelers or any means of getting in and out. I was making sure to make a little noise, whistling and crunching loudly through the snow so as not to startle someone who might not want company. The cabin was not the sort of pre-made ones you sometimes saw in showrooms. It looked to have been made of sturdy trees, and the wood looked new and raw. Someone had built this recently, and it made me even more aware of whoever was inside. It was pretty likely that a gun lived there as well, and I was in no hurry to be a squib in the local paper. As I knocked on the door, I felt a little like Goldilocks trying to introduce myself to the three bears. I don't know what possessed me, but when no one answered, I tried the knob. It opened easily, and the door wasn't locked, so I stepped out of the snow to find a roaring fire in the grate of the one-bedroom cabin. It was humble. A bed, a table, a large bookshelf that seemed to stretch the length of one wall, some chairs, and the fireplace. It was so warm after having come out of the cold that I couldn't help myself. I stepped inside and made a beeline for the fireplace. I was careful not to track snow in, leaving my boots and pack on the front porch in the hopes that whoever lived there would recognize that I was here and not be startled. I don't know where the owner of the cabin was, but if they were out hunting in this weather, I wasn't likely to receive a warm welcome. Either way, I didn't think I had any options with the snow falling and the night fast approaching. I sat by the fire, and as the flames dried my clothes, I couldn't help but look at the huge bookshelf that stretched across the wall. It was floor to ceiling, and as big as it was, there was still space for more books. The books were numerous, about 30 in all, and their spines had the names of people instead of titles. My curiosity got the better of me, and I went and took the first one down. The name, Jeremy Blake, was printed in gold leaf on the spine, and when I opened it, it cracked in that satisfying way that old books do. The owner of the home probably wouldn't appreciate me perusing their bookshelf, but I figured I already had enough to apologize for. What was one more thing, right? The inside was written in what appeared to be real ink, and the handwriting was delicate and practiced. Whoever Jeremy Blake had been, he'd been a very dab hand when it came to writing. I had assumed it was biographical, but the book didn't look old enough to have been written in 1736, as it claimed on the front cover. Jeremy talked about being out hunting deer with his brothers when they were suddenly set upon by a snowstorm. It had been snowing when they set out, but they now found themselves in a real blizzard. His brothers had left him when he couldn't keep up, and Jeremy thought he was about to die. That's when he saw the light out in the woods. He talked about coming upon the cabin, and how it had seemed so empty, but lived in. Like me, he had decided to thank the owner when he returned, and set about pinning this in his journal, which he'd brought with him. I pray the snow passes quickly. I would love nothing more than to return to my father's home, so that I might chastise my brothers for leaving me in such a sorry state. The next entry, though, was a little bit different. Jeremy had woken up to find that no one had returned to the cabin, and the snow was still falling outside. He had thought it looked a little better, and now that he was warm, he thought he might try to make his way home again. Jeremy opened the door to leave, but upon stepping out, he'd walked right back into the cabin instead. He tried this several more times, but always found himself stepping back into the warm, inviting cabin. There was only one door. When he tried to break a window in his fervor, he found they would not break. He became a little bit upset, fearing that he had stumbled into some kind of deviltry. He tried to leap through the window and nearly knocked himself unconscious. He had destroyed the house, flipped over tables and thrown chairs, but none of them had broken. When he turned around, it had all resumed its previous position, and Jeremy was certain that he had found some sort of witch's den, and was most afraid. The next few days were full of entries about Jeremy continuing to live inside the cabin, and discovering what it was all about. He found that he didn't need to eat or drink, which was both a blessing and a curse. Despite not needing these things, he found that he was always hungry, and constantly licking his lips when his mouth felt dry. He watched from the window as the snow began to melt, and as winter became spring, he watched the animals roam outside the cabin. After a while, his entries became a journal of what he'd seen from the cabin's windows, until I discovered the last entry in this long series of observations. I don't know if anyone will ever read this. I suppose it matters not. I've existed in this house for a long, long time. I cannot say how long, but I was not even 15 when I came in out of the cold, and now when I look at the glass over the fire, I see an old man staring back at me. I don't know how much longer I'll survive, but today I saw another person for the first time in a long time. I was looking out the window, watching the snow fall again, when a child came hesitantly from the tree line. He was looking at the small candle that had brought me here, but his eyes got big when he saw me looking back at him. He took a step towards the house, meaning to come inside or ask who I was, but I shooed him away. I think now that I should have let him open the door to see if I could escape, but I couldn't take the chance of that boy being stuck here as well. Better to die alone here than have some young fellow watch me pass. He scampered away when I banged on the glass and yelled at him. Probably for the best. I'm going to stop now. This journal does nothing but remind me that I'm alive. Maybe it would be better to be dead. I wasn't sure what to make of the journal. Was it real, or some make-believe story the owner had concocted? I looked at the bookcase and wondered if they were all like that. It was getting dark outside, so I took the second journal over to the fireplace so I could read it in the roaring light of the fire. A pine knot cracked as I got comfortable, and the whole experience was very rustic. The handwriting was a little rougher, not the same as the beautiful script of the previous one. Inside were the musings of a woodcutter. His writing was shorter, more surface level. He'd gotten lost while chopping wood and found the cabin on his way home. He stopped in to see who lived there and got himself trapped inside, just like the writer before him. He'd used his axe to try to break free, but to no avail. He'd taken up the book he found on the shelf and began writing to pass the time. Wasn't much, 3 or 4 pages before he stopped. He wrote about watching some squirrels, seeing a deer, and worrying that he would starve when he didn't find any food in the cabin. Whether he died or became bored, I don't know. He stopped writing about 5 pages in, signing Roland Wood at the bottom. The same name on the book spine, written in the same rough gold leaf that the words were written in. The next diary turned out to be a kind of fantasy story, something my grandpa would have called an oat opera. It talked about pioneers on the trail, one of them breaking off in the night to have a call of nature. He finds a strange cabin with a flickering candle, and once he went in, it refused to turn him loose. He spent a few pages talking about being trapped in the cabin, and when his sister came to look for him, he saw her and banged on the window to get her attention. She looked up, clearly startled, and ran away before she could help him. Whether she'd seen him or not, no one ever came to look for him. The rest of the journal was spent telling the story of the pioneers and what they must have seen on the trail. His sister seemed to be the main character, and he talked about the Indians they fought, the animals they hunted, and the things they survived on the way to their new home. Eventually she married a man, and the two lived on the prairie with their growing family on the outskirts of Preacher's Glen. Towards the end, he must have become a little jaded with the whole thing, and the story took a dark turn. His sister, her husband, and her children became riddled with hardships as the Indians descended upon their house, burning their crops and killing them all. The sister watched her family suffer for the crime of leaving her brother behind. The journal ended with her finally being allowed to die at the hands of her captors. He signed it William T. Pitt on the last page, and when I looked up from the story, I realized it was day again. As snow rattled loudly against the window, I had to wonder if it had only been a day. Jeremy's journal made it clear that the concept of time was a little wobbly. Had I been here a day? A week? A year? The snow was still blowing outside, but it didn't have to be the same storm that had brought me here. I looked at the door as I got up to put the book away, and wondered if I would find myself stepping right back into the cabin. I took a step towards the door, but I wasn't bold enough to try it yet. I needed more research first. With little else to do, I picked up the fourth journal. I noticed that William Pitt was on the spine of the third one as I put it back, and Beverly Stryker was on the spine of the one I took down. It seemed that the cabin had finally attracted a female resident, and I was interested in getting her point of view on the whole situation. Beverly's story was a little different from the others. Miss Stryker was in trouble when she found the cabin. Beverly had been fleeing into the night to escape her abusive husband. She hadn't wanted to marry him. He was not the sort of man that women like to marry, but she had made the mistake of falling for him when she was young, not realizing what a brute he was until it was too late. By then, her father had decided that if his youngest daughter wanted to marry someone so far below her station, then he would let her. He had enough useless mouths to feed, useless mouths in need of dowries, and her husband had asked relatively little from him by way of a dowry. The two had been wed less than a year when Beverly had run away for the first time. He had found her easily enough. Her husband was a hunter, and her trail had been easy to follow. He had his farm hands tie her up in the barn and whipped her with a horsewhip he used on the colts when they were breaking them in. Her skin had been covered in welts, broken and red from the lashing, and Beverly had been left in the barn overnight to think about what she'd done. She thought all right, but it wasn't likely the reflection her husband had been thinking of. Beverly lay in the filthy hay all night, thinking about her current situation and planning her next escape attempt. She played the dutiful wife for the next 3 months, filling his cup, cooking his dinner, and keeping his house like he liked, until her husband grew lazy again. He stopped having the hands watch her so closely. He stopped locking the bolts every night so she couldn't escape. He stopped putting the dogs out every night so they would alert him when she left. Then one night, she ran, but not fast enough. He was after her sooner than she expected, and she had heard the bang of the dogs and the clump, clump, clump of the horses' hooves. She was running through the woods, the early autumn chill sending goosebumps up her skin. She hadn't gotten dressed in anything heavier than a shift. If he'd caught her getting dressed, he'd have known she meant to run. So now she ran in the light of the late-year moon, her body bathed in the golden light as she fled for her life. When she had fallen, she had expected to be ridden down out of hand, but the hooves and the dogs went past her as she lay curled in the boughs beneath a tree. The roots made a kind of cage, Beverly looking through the bars as she listened to insects and night birds singing their song. She expected to be found, expected to be caught, but as the night deepened, she found it was only her out in the wilderness. The dancing light had stolen her from her worries, and that was when she noticed the candle. Beverly found the cabin and had been trapped by the enticing cage. There wasn't much after that. She'd written a little more, but nothing as exciting as the night run through the forest. She read the journals and discovered that she couldn't leave, but there was none of the fear or uncertainty the others had shown. She was content in this place, a place her husband couldn't find. She lived inside the cabin, updating the journal sparingly and passing away with nothing to show for it, and no one the wiser. I looked at the door again, but the next book looked so inviting. Books became my food. I devoured them, reading some of them and taking their stories in. The cabin had attracted many in its lifetime, and I wondered how many more had chosen not to write. How many had suffered in silence here? How many had simply wasted away with nothing to mark their passing, except their memories? Those who had written had left behind everything, from pages and pages of observation to short little stories about nothing at all. They wrote fantasies, westerns, slice-of-life stories about the people they'd left behind, and it all became more and more modern as time went on. I don't know how long I sat there reading, but it was snowing again when I looked up to find a journal in my hand with my own name on it. I opened it and found the pages as white and blank as the landscape outside my window. The doorknob was cold when I wrapped my hand around it. The wind was cold as it blew snow in through the open door. My boots were still on the porch, but they looked old and weather-beaten. The backpack was gone, likely dragged off by some animal while I was reading. The boots had been tan when I bought them less than a year before I entered the cabin. Now they looked bleached, the fabric thin as a mummy's cheek. I wanted to reach out and touch them, to see if my fingers would go through the thin skin of the boots, but I knew I would never get close to them. I stepped out onto the porch and found my foot coming down on the hardwood floor of the cabin. I closed the door and went back to the fire, picking up the journal with my name on it. If you're reading this, then it's already too late. I don't know if this place is supernatural or just some old pocket out of time, but I do know that it's a trap. I don't know if there's any escape from this place, but I know that no one's coming to look for me. I hope my diary is the last, but I have no doubt there will be others. The house seems to draw us to it, collecting stories as it collects lives. At least, I'll be warm before I die. I looked down at what I'd written, unsure of what else to say. It was barely a page, and the effort seemed lame. I was no writer. I'd never done more than emails or text messages. But as I struggled to find something to add to it, the futility of the exercise hit me all at once. If someone read it, they would be trapped anyway. My warning wouldn't help them, and my eyes slipped over to the fire as I thought about just burning it. Would it burn? I didn't know, but if the cabin wanted lives, then why give it what it wanted? Then I turned back to the door and thought of something a little different. An experiment might bear results. The book thumped onto the porch when I tossed it, and when I turned back to the bookshelf, it hadn't returned to its spot. The snow skittered across the pages, leaving wet runners on the paper as they marked them. They fluttered back and forth as the wind hit them, but the book was a little too heavy to be pushed by the wind. The snow seemed loath to come up on the porch, so I didn't think it would ruin it. When I closed the door, I hoped that someone would see it before they opened it. I had added a little bit at the end, and as I sat shivering by the fire, I hoped they would notice the book and follow the instructions before barging in. Knock 3 times and open the door. Under no circumstances come in. If the house is empty, run away as fast as you can. If I'm here, hopefully you can help me escape." It was the only job I was allowed to have in high school. My parents thought that working in fast food would put me in contact with shifty adults who would only want to groom me, and that retail would hurt my self-esteem and take me out of the religious environment they had brought me up in. What it came down to was that they wanted me to be on call to watch their kids whenever they wanted me to. So, the career they gave me access to made a lot of sense. My older sister had been a member of the local babysitting service since she was 15, so I signed up as well. It wasn't all bad, but a lot of it was pretty terrible. I've been left with kids until the next morning, when the parents assured me that they'd be back by 9 at the latest. I've been forced to go out and buy groceries unless I wanted the kids to go hungry, and yes, with the kids in tow. I've been screamed at for letting the kids watch TV, been fired without pay for having them turn up covered in their mother's makeup after being in their room playing, and even had one of them prank call the cops and had to explain what had happened to them. On the other hand, I'd been to some really well-behaved households and sat for some really funny kids that were more than happy to just hang out and have a nice night. I have about 5 families that I babysat for on the regular, and the money I made was nice, but the real money seemed to be in the difficult clients that sometimes came up. Usually it was just troubled kids, or worse, kids with needy parents. I had taken a few of these jobs, and though the pay was usually above average, it always came with strings, special diets, procedures for home security. I even had one mother who told me I had to anoint her child before bed so the devil couldn't invade her. Those were all child's play, though, when it came to Norman. I'll never forget Norman, as long as I live. It was Saturday, and the agency called around 5 in the afternoon. I was home, pointing at my watch as I reminded my brother that I had dibs on the 5:30 to 6:30 TV slot, and I sighed as Mrs. Jackson asked for me. Tripp smiled. It appeared I wasn't going to be there to use the TV slots. "I have some clients who are looking for a sitter. 27 Bridshaw Lane. Are you familiar with them?" "Nope," I said, holding the phone against my ear. "Never sat for them before." "The family is the Foremans. Their son, Norman, is kind of a difficult child. He's run off 4 other sitters that I know of, but his parents are willing to pay triple rates for the night off. Are you interested?" I chewed on my lip and thought about it. Triple the usual rate would be nice, but problem kids were usually a handful. I asked about dietary restrictions or weird allergies, but Mrs. Jackson just told me that the parents would fill me in. "Be there at 6, and good luck to you, girlie." I told my mom, and she said it would be okay if I went and sat for the night. Dad even said he'd give me a ride so I didn't have to ride my bike clear across town, and I was pretty grateful. The thought of riding my bike almost 3 miles, some of it uphill, was far from appealing, so I thanked him with a big old hug and went to get my sitting sack. The sitting sack was something that I'd put together the year before, and it contained a bunch of things kids usually like to be occupied with. Coloring books, stickers, those little plastic stick-on figures that you could get in different characters and properties, storybooks, jacks, a deck of cards, and my old standby for the really difficult ones, a little handheld game of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles variety. It was all inside a worn-out purse my mom had given me, a throwback to her hippie days, and once I had it and something sensible to wear, I came downstairs and told my mom I'd call them and let them know how late I'd be. "Well," my mom called from the kitchen, "tell them that we really like our daughter home before 11. I told her I would and went to hop in Dad's old Ford truck, which was running and waiting. 20 minutes later, I was standing in front of 27 Bridshaw Lane, waving at Dad as he rolled away. The house looked normal enough, a ranch-style home in a brick red, and there were some toys in the yard, a little blue beetle sitting under the carport. It appeared to be a lovely house, but when I rang the bell and saw the man who answered the door, I almost wished I'd asked Dad to come with me. Mr. Foreman looked, well, off, I guess. Not like funny uncle off, but like someone who hasn't slept in a long time off. The guy looked a little crazy, a little unsure of me, but mostly like I was a life raft near the side of the Titanic. Oh, thank God! I was afraid the agency wouldn't be able to find one. Sharon, the sitter's here. The man was in a polo shirt and slacks, and his wife, who came from the back of the house in a frizz of red hair and sundress, looked just as manic as he did. She was putting in her earrings, and her other hand was trailing a small boy who seemed to be keeping pace with her. The kid, it had to be Norman, looked like Christopher Robin in the books I usually read to my siblings. He was tall for his age, bearing a dark brown bowl cut and a pair of footy pajamas that looked just about ready for the Salvation Army rag bag. In his other hand, the one not clamped to his mother's arm, was a stuffed bear that looked ready for the very same rag bag. The poor thing looked like it had done 2 tours overseas and was about to go for lucky number 3. One eye was hanging by a thread, one arm was trailing stuffing, and the fur was possessed of that smoothness that made me think it had survived many washings and many more playdates. "Thank goodness," said the mother, and she breathed it out like a prayer. "Hello, I'm Sharon, and this is my husband David." We exchanged pleasantries, and then, though I didn't recognize it at the time, it felt like the mother steeled herself before introducing Norman. "This is our son, Norman. He's 5. Say hello to the nice lady, Norman." Norman, in typical shy 5-year-old fashion, peeked out from behind his mother's leg and lifted a single hand before disappearing again. "He's already eaten, had his bath, and he's in his jammies. Norman needs to be in bed by 8 o'clock at the latest. He isn't to sneak any cookies or jump on the furniture, and he isn't to give you a hard time. Right, Norman?" she asked. I'd heard a dozen mothers give a speech like this before, but this one felt a little off. The mother wasn't giving her child an implied or else statement. Sharon Foreman was almost begging Norman not to give me a hard time, and it put me on edge. "We'll be back around 10, David Foreman said. "That's at the latest. If there's any problems, you can reach us at the restaurant, Marco's on 15th. We'll be taking in a movie after that, but we should absolutely be home by 10 at the latest. We told the agency we'd pay you triple the usual rate, but if that's not enough..." No, that's fine. You have nothing to worry about. Does Norman have any special allergies or instructions or, anything?" Sharon Foreman looked down at her son, one of those unpainted nails coming up to her mouth, and shook a little as she looked back at me. "His bear, his lovey, don't ever let him be without it. It's very important to him, and bad things happen when he's without it." "Make sure he always has it," David reiterated. "Never let it leave his side." They looked so serious about the health of a bear that I just nodded and said I would. They left then, kissing Norman and telling him to be good, and then it was just the two of us. "So, Norman," I said, smiling, "what would you like to do? But he just walked off, the threadbare bear swinging from his hand. I shrugged, figuring he wanted to do his own thing, and went to call my dad and let him know I'd be done around 10. He said that was fine, told me to be safe, and that left me alone in this big old house with a very odd kid. I took some of the stuff out of my bag and called out to get Norman's attention. I shuffled the deck of cards dramatically, took out some of the coloring books and colored a couple of pictures, and after bouncing the ball and offering to play jacks, I just kind of gave up. It wasn't bad for the first couple of hours. Norman was quiet, moving around the house like a little ghost and playing games with his bear. I sat in the living room with my book, watching over the top of the pages to see what he was up to. He came around the corner with a pirate hat and spoke like a buccaneer to his bear, the little toy sporting a bandana. For 2 hours, Norman came running into the living room with different costumes, the bear wearing something similar. And for 2 hours, I watched him play pirates, knights, and finally cowboys and Indians. I was smiling at the little bear in his headdress when I heard the clock chime 8 of the clock. "All right, kiddo. Time to start getting ready for bed." Norman turned slowly, one eye still closed, as he extended his revolver to the bear in the Indian headdress. "But I'm not tired yet," he said, and it was the first time I'd heard him speak. His voice didn't sound like a normal little kid voice. His voice was deadpan, strangely calm, and his eyes were 2 intense pools of something I didn't have a name for. He was unsettling, to say the least. Sorry, buddy. Your mom was pretty clear on bedtime. Let's go brush those teeth and get ready for bed." Norman stared at me for a few more seconds, but he finally nodded and headed to the bathroom to brush his teeth. I was relieved when he left without a fight. Norman was pretty spooky. At the end of the day, however, he was a little boy, and I could handle little kids. Norman was probably 60 pounds soaking wet, and I had brothers that would have made up 2 of this kid. I had just turned back to my book, checking the clock as the minutes ticked by. And then I heard it come ripping from the back of the house. It rolled towards me like a wave of terrible fog, and I shuddered even as I jumped. "Where is he?" he screamed, and his voice was anything but calm and reasonable now. He came thumping from the back of the house, his breath coming in gasps as his hate-filled eyes bored into me. "Where is he?" he asked again. "Where's who?" I asked, standing up and putting my book down. "Who are you talking about?" "My bear! My lovey! Where is he?" My fear and confusion began to ebb away as I remembered what they had said about the bear. "Oh," I thought, "he's just lost his bear. We can find it and everything will be fine." I got down at eye level, the same thing I had done dozens of other times, and attempted to soothe him. "Hey, it's okay, sweetie. You probably just left it in the bathroom. Let's go search for it and see if we can't..." His head flopped back suddenly, making me worried he was having a fit, and then something started rising from his open mouth. I backed up a little, falling on my butt as black smoke began to pour out of him. His eyes had rolled up to the whites, his mouth hung limply open, and something like smog off a garbage fire was beginning to billow out of his open mouth. "Where is he?" he bawled, his voice hollow and deep. "Where is he? My lovey!" I backed away, not sure what to do. I'd dealt with some real tantrums before, but this was a first. The smog was beginning to fill the room, clouding my sight and making it hard to see. I coughed as I breathed it in, the smoke tasting like burnt plastic and fireplace ash, and I knew I had to get out of here. No, I didn't have to get out of here. I may not know exactly what was going on, but I knew that it wouldn't stop until I'd returned the bear to him. I ran for the back of the house, covering my mouth with my shirt, and as I did, the smog came after me. It was going to fill the house before long, and I needed to move quickly. I expected the bear to be in the bathroom, but he was nowhere to be seen. I peeked into Norman's bedroom and found a nice, normal little boy's room, but no bear. The smog was getting thicker now, and it looked like a fire was starting to engulf the house. I coughed, the smoke was choking me, and as I turned around, I saw Norman in the doorway to his room. The smoke was coming out of his eyes and his nose now, too, and the longer it went on, the less sure I was that I'd find it in time. "Where is he?" he bellowed, and I half cried as I pushed past him and headed for the front door. This was not worth triple pay, not even quadruple pay, but as I tried to open the door, I found the knob unturnable. It was like someone was holding it from the other side, and as he came slowly up the hall towards me, I backed into the kitchen. I was choking now, my eyes watering, and when I bumped into the table, I heard something slide off and hit the floor. It was the sit sack. It spilled out, but it was impossible to tell where all of it went. The smoke was so thick and my eyes were so watery that I couldn't have told you what was 5 feet in front of me. The only exception seemed to be Norman. He kept coming towards me, his body a living vessel for the smoke, and as I gasped for air, I tried to reason with him. "Norman, let's talk about this. Give me some time. I can't help you find Mr. Bear, but you have to get rid of all this smoke." "Where is he?" he bellowed, and it seemed to be the only thing he could say. My throat was aching from the coughing, my eyes watering, and my breath becoming harder and harder to pull in. I was going to die here. I was sure of it, and I tried to beg him not to kill me, but the smoke made speech impossible. Then, Norman's foot came down on something, and he suddenly stopped. His head canted down, something flashing beneath the smoke, and I heard something that made me think I might be going crazy. There was a tinny, 8-bit sound from beneath the smoke, and I realized he'd found my trump card, the one I held out for the problem kids. His eyes rolled down like a pair of window shades, and he reached down and picked up the little white handheld. "Oh, cool," he said, in that hollow voice I'd come to hate. "Ninja Turtles." The smoke began to dissipate, and as he sat on the floor, his legs going crisscross applesauce, I just sat there in shock for a moment. I was speechless. It was unthinkable. I'd been minutes from death, seconds from passing out due to smoke inhalation, and my life had been saved by 4 mutant turtles and a cheap $5 handheld game from Walmart. I was sitting on the porch when his parents got home an hour later. I left Norman sitting on the floor in the kitchen, still plinking away at his game, and the parents must have suspected that something had happened. They both looked worried as they caught sight of me, and as Sharon went in to check on Norman, David sat down beside me on the stoop and sighed deeply. "It happened, didn't it?" He didn't need to elaborate, and I just nodded in response. "Here," he said, handing me way more than we'd agreed upon. I counted it later, and there was almost $200 there. He had clearly been relieved to find me alive and had decided to compensate me accordingly. "You don't have to answer right now, but if you'd like to sit for Norman again, we would be very grateful. It's very difficult to find sitters who are willing to come back for a second sit, but I think that Norman would like it if you came back again." I told him I'd think about it, and I did. You'd probably think that's weird, but $200 is a big motivator. The next time Mrs. Jackson called, about 2 weeks later, in fact, and asked if I wanted to sit for the Foremans again, I agreed. I needed some money for an upcoming school trip, and they were still promising triple the average rate. I told myself that if anything weird happened, then I'd go outside, and this would be the last time, but to my surprise, the Foremans looked a lot less stressed. Mr. Foreman looked like he'd been getting regular sleep, and Mrs. Foreman hugged me when I walked in. They thanked me for coming back, saying that Norman had been in a much better mood lately, and as I came in, I couldn't help but notice the source of his improved mood. He was sitting on the couch, the handheld game still in hand, and his eyes were glued to the screen. I babysat for Norman for another 4 years, until I went to college, and the Foremans were always generous. Norman graduated to a couple of different things, but he always kept that little handheld, and I always brought fresh batteries in my bag, just in case. I never had another experience like I did that night, and I never wanted to again. A year after I went to college, the Foremans showed up in the last place I would have expected. I read their names in the obituary section. They both died of smoke inhalation one night, though there was no sign of a fire. There was no sign of Norman either, and I wonder sometimes what happened to him. He's never reached out, and I've never gone looking. I hope wherever he is, he has fresh batteries.
My grandmother has been catatonic for the last 5 years. On the night that Grandpa died, her neighbors called the police to come check on her. They said she was screaming loud enough to be heard 3 houses down, and when the paramedics arrived, she had ruptured something in her throat. Grandpa was dead in the bed they shared, a heart attack, and they zipped Grandpa into that black bag that would take him to the morgue. They carried Grandma out on a stretcher, however. After that, she wouldn't speak, wouldn't move. She just laid in bed and stared at the ceiling of her room in Shady Lane Nursing Home. My grandma, always a strong lady, is fed mechanically. She wears a diaper that an orderly has to change. The physical exercise she gets comes in the form of a physical therapist moving her legs for her as she stays in bed. If she leaves the room, it's because Denise or Reggie, the only 2 orderlies that seem to give a crap about the residents, lift her into her wheelchair and take her outside, or maybe to use the resource center, which is really just a fancy word for the TV room. I begin my story in this way, so you'll know how weird today's events were. I'm a 35-year-old father of 2. I've been married since I was 27 to the love of my life. I thought that after 8 years of marriage and raising kids, nothing could get to me like it did today. I'm sitting at my computer, a bottle of scotch at my elbow, sinking into a fear of returning to my marriage bed. It all started when I went to visit my grandma today. My family has a system. My mom and dad go visit Grandma on Monday. I visit on Wednesday. My little sister Lisa goes on Friday. And we all go to visit on Sunday after church. My wife doesn't go every time, but she comes with me sometimes. She's known Grandma since we were 17, and she remembers her before her current condition. She wasn't particularly close with my grandparents, but I think she likes to be there for me. My grandma and I have always been close. I love my grandma, and I don't want to waste the time I might have left with her. Whether she knows I'm there or not, it's the thought that counts, and I owe her that much. I went on my lunch break today to see her. Reggie was there when I came in. He gave me a big smile as he finished fussing with her pillows. "It always warms my heart to see you and your sister coming to visit the old girl," he said. He let me know her vitals, told me about the doctor's visit she'd had last week, and then he said he'd leave us to our visit. Just me and Grandma. I took out my lunch and made some one-sided small talk as I ate. I had read somewhere that coma patients are aware that someone is talking to them, and in some cases, it sometimes helps them come out of it. Grandma wasn't really in a coma. No one really knew what was going on with her, but I like to think that maybe one day she'd come out of it and thank me for all the lovely visits. She'd say that it was my voice that had kept her going all those years. I'm pretty sure my sister just played on her phone the whole time she was there, and I'd feel like I'd helped Grandma in some way, while she was going through some troubled times. Be careful what you wish for, I guess. I was just telling Grandma about a client I had helped at work when she suddenly inhaled sharply and exhaled in a rattling, skeletal way. I paused, my hand still holding hers as it always did, and was about to get Reggie. Suddenly, the hand tightened spasmodically, and she made another of those rattling breaths, her eyes rolling wildly. She was like a frightened horse looking for an escape, and though it was the middle of the day, I felt a cold chill run through me as she shuddered and gasped in pure terror. "His hands, the hands of the dead," she breathed out. I pushed back suddenly, letting go of her clenching hand. "Grandma, are you? Oh, listen to me. I don't have much time, Bug." She was awake. Her face was pale and thin, her hands little more than fleshy claws, but she was awake. She was looking at me in that way that people look at fire exits in infernos, and as I tried to get up, she reached out again and took my hand in her cold, damp embrace. I wanted to get Reggie. Reggie would know what to do, but the naked want on her face held me in place. I knew I wasn't going anywhere. She'd called me Bug. That had always been her nickname for me, and when she said it, I realized how much I had wanted to hear her say it again. "Please, Bug, I need to tell you what he said. You need to know." She was frantic, almost pleading, and my knees sent me down without thinking. This is what she told me. They had been in bed together when it had happened. They were both at that advanced age where laying together was just that. The two were in bed, sleeping, just being with each other, when Granddad had suddenly woken her up. His arms had been around her, her back against his front. I knew from familiarity that this was how they'd slept since they'd been married since they were 17. The position was natural as sleep itself to them. His shuddering had woken her up. His hands were grasping at me. His fingers were together like a pair of mittens, and he was opening and closing like a slow, painful machine. His mouth was against my ear, and his breath was raspy and panting. He sounded like he'd been running, and as he bucked around, I knew he was having another heart attack. Your granddad's health hadn't been good for a while, but as I tried to break free of his arms, he held me tight and leaned his mouth in close. "No, Ellie, don't go, please. I'm scared. I'm scared." He said it, and God help me, he sounded terrified. "Don't be scared, Roy," I told him. "You'll be okay. I'll call Dr. Stevens, and I can't see, Ellie." That's what he said to me. "I can't see. They say you see the light or hear a voice, but I can't see anything, Ellie. It's all just black. All just black. I can't see his face or hear his voice." He gripped me then, hard, and I felt his nails through my nightshirt as he did it. His heart attack was bad, and I was terrified that he wouldn't come through this time. I tried to break free. I tried to get loose, but his arms were so rigid that I couldn't get away. The whole time he's just panting and telling me how there's nothing there, and it's all just blackness, and he knows there's nothing there. He kept right on repeating it, even as his voice went on and on, until finally it just went out, and then he leaned in close until his lips were right at my ear, and he breathed out one final time. That was the first time I screamed. I screamed because I was in the arms of a dead man. He was gone, Bug. He'd breathed his last, and that was that, but now I was caught in his last embrace. Her voice took on a tenuous, hysterical sound, and I remember thinking that somewhere a machine must be going off. Somewhere telemetry must be telling someone how her heart was racing along much too fast. Someone somewhere must be on their way with a crash cart or a doctor or a shot to calm her, because in this room she was close to hysterics. I wanted to get that shot. As many times as I'd prayed to God to hear her speak again, I wanted to see that man come through the door with that shot so she could slip off again. As much as I wanted her back, I knew that this was not okay. At that moment, I just wanted her catatonic again. I wanted this jittery, hysterical creature out of pain. I pulled at his hand, those long hands that would take mine sometimes, and they were hard as stone. They locked in death, and now I could not separate them. His weight was a stone around me, and I was afraid, Bug. I was afraid that I'd never get loose, that they'd find us both dead right there, him of a heart attack, and me of just plain old starvation. Her voice broke, and when she closed her hurting green eyes, I saw the tears spilling out of them. I had to break his fingers. They sounded like dry twigs when they crack in the fire, and after I'd broken 4 of them, I almost had his hands apart. That's when he came back. She whispered this as though he might hear her. Her words made my blood run cold. He'd been dead for 5 minutes, Bug. His chest was close enough that I could feel nothing beating. But all of a sudden, his arms tightened around me, and he screamed in my ear like a wolf in a trap. He pulled me hard against him. I felt my ribs trying to break, and all of a sudden, he was bucking and thrashing like the devil himself had a hold on him. It burns, Ellie, he just kept screaming and screaming into my ear. And when I finally thrust his hands apart, I rolled out of bed and got as far as I could. That's where they found me. They found me in the corner. They found me screaming. I don't know what was burning him, but I saw his last few minutes before he went out again. He writhed, he screamed, and he died in agony. What kind of place could make a man scream like that? I thought to myself, I don't ever want to go to that place. What kind of place could it be? What kind of place? What kind of place? What kind of place? She just kept right on, mumbling that phrase again and again and again until I couldn't take it anymore. I got up and ran out as fast as I could. I never looked back. I don't know what I'll do next time I have to see her. I didn't go back to work. I called my boss and told him I wasn't feeling well and needed to go home. He let me. He's a good guy. When I called Reggie later that afternoon, he told me that she was right as rain, as usual. When he'd given her her meds that afternoon, she was still lying in bed, staring at the ceiling as always. He never hinted at any change in the telemetry, never said a word about abnormal vitals, just told me how much he knew it meant to her that I came to visit. Now, I'm sitting at my computer and I don't know what to do. I've been sitting here for about an hour, contemplating how I'll get on with the rest of my life, knowing my grandfather's agony and my grandmother's terror at the end of his life. I've been contemplating how I'll climb in bed with my own wife tonight, a problem that seems to be more here and now. You see, the thought of her wrapping her arms around me, placing her chest against my back, it makes me want to shudder right out of my skin. What would I do if she woke up in the throes of a heart attack? What would I do if she whispered those same hopeless words into my ear as she died? What would I do if I found myself trapped in my own dying love's last embrace?
If walls could talk, Joshua mumbled under his breath as he walked through the ancient old arches of the hotel. Approaching the wide check-in desk was like stepping back in time, but the image was ruined by the girl with her phone out and her AirPods stuffed in her ears. She was smacking her gum and perusing Face Space or Tic Tacs or whatever people her age did. Joshua hadn't really had time for any of that in a while. He hadn't seemed to have much time for anything these days. The girl at the desk looked young enough to be his daughter, and her smile was that perfect mix of customer service charm and barely masked indifference. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you?" Joshua looked up at her, and she must have seen something that spooked her in his hollow eyes, because he saw some of that indifference slip into something resembling concern. Not concern for him. That would have been a little too genuine an emotion to show a stranger. She was concerned that he might be a weirdo. She had clearly been warned about spotting weirdos. The hotel likely got its share of rent and ditchers or guys who wound up naked in the hot tub at 3 a.m., and she was on the lookout for trouble before it reared its head. The hotel manager likely had them keeping an eye out for these sort of weirdos who wanted to become permanent residents. If she saw that on his face, he knew he'd be screwed. Joshua tried to fix his face, but it was a struggle. "Checking in," he said, handing her his credit card and reservation paperwork. She looked at the paperwork as if the concept were foreign to her, before turning to the computer and clicking away at the register. He figured it was likely something that she didn't deal with regularly. The Leaser Moor was not some posh establishment, not some trendy spot that housed celebrities or jet-setters. It was an old hotel that attracted tourists and people who liked to bask in historic places. That's why Susan had come here, after all. She'd been here to photograph the hotel for a travel magazine, her 4th assignment as a freelancer, and her last. She pulled him up, and Joshua saw her bite her lip when the room number popped up. "Ooh, that's gotta be a mistake. Sorry, sir, but that room isn't one we usually rent out." "I'm aware. That's why I requested it." She looked shocked, like she didn't know what to say. "I hate to tell you this, but someone went missing in there pretty recently." She had pitched her voice low like it was a rat problem, or some mold that could have been steam cleaned out. Joshua wanted to be angry. He wanted to tell her that he knew someone had gone missing in there, and that 6 months and 5 days wasn't recent to him. 6 months and 5 days was when his world had crumbled, and it was a day he would never forget. He wanted to tell her that his wife had not been some rat infestation or a mold colony that could be cleaned, poisoned, or time erased. He wanted to tell her all these things in a flurry of anger and hatred, but he knew she wouldn't understand. "I've been informed. I like to stay in rooms like that and try to gauge paranormal happenings. It's a hobby of mine. Since I was in the city anyway, I figured I would take that room." The young woman sighed as she finished checking him in. "That's good. She just thought he was a weirdo." Weirdo was fine. A weirdo might set up some cameras, pull out a ghost box or an Ouija board, light some candles, and pretend to be a ghostbuster or a medium for a few days before leaving. One look at the suitcase probably told her that he had brought all his toys with him so he could play pretend, but she had no idea what games he intended to play. There was only one tool in that bag, and it wasn't for playing. "And you're all set," she said, handing him his key card. "Please enjoy your stay at the Leaser Moor." Her smile was back, that fabricated grin that hid her disinterest. She just wanted him to leave so she could get back to Snapchatting or Twittering or whatever she was doing. She'd have something to tell her friends about tomorrow when she came in for her morning shift and heard about the mess he'd left in his room. Joshua pushed the button for the elevator and rode it up to the 7th floor. The hallway was done in that early 80s cinema style that made you think the floor was furry or sticky. The carpet pattern shifted in slightly nauseating diamonds as he walked down the hall towards his room. The thought that this would be the last thing he ever saw was a little disappointing, but that was reality. With any luck, his daughter wouldn't get his letter until Monday, not unless the post office near the college was feeling excessively ambitious. It would be too late for him to stop him either way. Joshua had laid out everything he needed to, explaining that he couldn't live without her mother, and that if her spirit resided somewhere in this room, he wanted to be with her. She could have his money, his savings, the car, the house, and anything else he owned, so she could finish school and make something of herself. All he wanted was Susan. He came to the door of room 712 much too soon, and as he slid the key into the lock, He glanced at the room where his wife had spent her last few hours of life. As the door came open, he was a little disappointed to find that it was just another bland hotel room. 2 beds, a dresser, an old TV that looked ready for the dump, a flimsy-looking chair, a nightstand that doubtlessly held a Bible, and the wall, whose color scheme sat somewhere between warm brown sugar and runny crap. Had this really been Susan's final destination? Had these uninteresting walls been the last thing she'd seen before leaving this room for the last time? Joshua set his suitcase down and took a seat on the bed, suddenly hoping not. Let her have seen the sights, taken a meal, and taken her final breath anywhere but here. The sun set outside the window as he sat on the bed, casting shadows across the room. As the darkness came to fill the empty space, Joshua became aware of strange patterns on the wall. The smears seemed to move as the shadows became gantries, and some looked eerily like faces. Suddenly the room was far too crowded, the multitudes watching him from the walls of the room, their judgment palpable. Joshua could hear the nightlife waking up, the people rumbling from the street below as the cabs and the music created a strange cacophony. He opened the suitcase and pulled out the gun, deciding that this would be a fine time to do it. Every minute he put it off was another chance for something to go wrong. It also gave his courage a chance to slip. If Kara got the letter and he couldn't follow through, he'd be spending the foreseeable future in a mental facility. Having to sit in the sterile room on a paper gown, orderlies medicating him to the point of catatonia, would be worse than death. As he set the cold barrel against his head, he whispered a final apology to Susan as his finger hovered over the trigger. "Stop!" It took every ounce of trigger control not to blow the top of his head off by accident. Joshua turned, his eyes growing wide as he recognized the face that had yelled at him. He wasn't sure what he had expected, a ghost or a manifestation, or maybe just a final mental break that would prove less supernatural and more existential. But he never expected to see one of the slightly expressive wall faces staring at him with panic. It reminded him of a mannequin's face, featureless and barely expressive, but as he watched it, it spoke again, and he heard the voice of his dead wife coming from the bland wallpaper. "Please, I can't watch you kill yourself." Joshua crawled across the bed, his shocked face locked onto the unremarkable one looking at him from the wall. "Susan?" The eyeless face stared at him as he got closer, and despite being devoid of anything remotely close to features, he began to see his dead wife's face beneath it. The scar on her cheek that she'd gotten in high school, the small nose he'd loved to kiss the tip of, the eyes that were slightly too close together, her lips that looked just as full and sensuous as they had before she'd left. The closer he looked, the more he saw. The more he saw, the closer he came. Is it you?" "It is," she said, the corner of her mouth pulling up as she studied him. "It's good to see you." "But how?" he said, stuttering as he leaned off the bed, closer and closer to that wall of perpetual faces. I don't know," she whispered, her lips forming the words delicately. "I woke up to see a face on the wall looking back at me, and as we stared at each other, it began to speak." He leaned in closer, slipping off the bed as his knees brought him closer to the spot on the wall where Susan's face lay. "He asked what I was doing in his room, and after I explained that I had rented it from the hotel, he told me how he was staying here on a business trip when he had seen the faces as well. They all live here, Josh. Once I became part of them, I got to know them and heard their stories. They were all once people who stayed in this very room, people on vacation, people on business, people with families, people estranged, all seeking purpose in something and finding it here. Joshua crawled on his knees like a penitent before an idol, but his mind demanded caution. The other faces were looking at him, pushing against the wall like someone behind a thick plastic sheet as they tried to break free. Joshua could see their multitudes in the dim light from the window as they pressed and receded like a tide. "Come closer, dear. It's hard to talk through this veil." He obliged, now halfway between the bed and the wall. He wanted to turn on the lights and take a better look at her face, but he was afraid that the light might ruin it. Hadn't he failed to see it until dark? He'd been sitting in this room for hours, waiting for the right time to join her. Now, here she was, coming to him in his time of need. "Wait for me, please. I'll join you. I don't want to live without you, Susan. My life is meaningless without you. Can you take me where you are? Is there some way?" "I want to apologize," she whispered, and Joshua came a little closer as her words were lost in the blare of a car horn. You have nothing to apologize for. You didn't ask to leave me. I came here to join you, to see if your spirit lingered here and I could find you once I passed on. Kara's grown. She doesn't need me. But I need you." He was closer now, and if he had reached out, he could have almost touched that porcelain face. The live wire in his head, however, that ancient alarm that warns of danger, just wouldn't stop going off, and his hands trembled as he tried to make them reach. "Not for that. I want to apologize for what I did while I was here." He felt his breath stick in his throat, his next words held in check as he waited for her to go on. In spite of himself, he crawled a little closer. "When the faces woke me up, I wasn't in bed alone. I had gone to see the nightlife, to see the city, and as I sat in one of the trendy bars, I met someone. He was charming, a real ladies' man, and one thing led to another, and I let him convince me to take him back to my hotel room. I could blame it on the wine, but I know that wasn't all of it. I was bored, dear. I felt trapped by our life, smothered by what we had built, and that's why I agreed to the job in the first place. I wanted something new, something different, and though I didn't set out to find someone else, I ended up being untrue to you." Joshua felt the ice slithering into his heart, his lungs seething as his body shook with effort. He was drowning. He was suffocating, his body refusing to draw breath. How could she do this to him? This couldn't be true. Something was messing with him. This couldn't be his wife. She would never do that. She couldn't. Even though he was left breathless by her secret, his knees still carried him forward. Please say something. Can you forgive me? It was a lapse in judgment. I'm sorry." "I don't care," he rasped. "I don't care what you've done. I forgive you. I want to be with you again." His hands slid around the edges of the mask, caressing her face as he leaned in close. "Please don't leave me. I can't live without you." He leaned his head against her mask and felt her perfect lips turn up in a smile. then let us never be parted again, my love." He felt her lips twist into a smile, too large for a human mouth to contain. The corners tore, her cheeks splitting as her mouth opened wide like a snake. He didn't struggle as her mouth enveloped him, the face elongating as she pulled him in. He opened his eyes to see that her face had grown to take in the whole wall. Her features had warped into something akin to the face of one of the demonic statues you saw in churches sometimes, and it warped and tilted oddly on that flat plane. "You aren't really my wife, are you?" "No, but I can take you to her. You'll find many of her friends inside the walls." "I hate going into this room," Maria said, her cart making a strangely chuffy noise on the carpet as she and Loa came inside. "Why? It's no different from any other room. It just always seems like something is watching me here." As she fixed the bed, Maria couldn't help but glance over her shoulder at the wall. Loa was wrong. This room was unlike anything in the hotel. The paint here always looked like faces, and the faces were always staring right at her when she came in to clean. As she looked at the wall, the paint looked thick in places, like a splash of blood left to dry. The faces leered at her from every corner, and she squinted a little as she noticed a new one. She cleaned this room once a day. The 7th floor was her assigned floor, after all, and she could have sworn that no face had been in that spot before. As she watched, it almost seemed to turn to her, the featureless face somehow regarding her. "Hello?" it rasped, its voice thick and coarse, but also inviting as it fell over her like a... "Did you say something, Maria?" Loa asked, and the little maid shook herself as she turned away from the wall. When she glanced back, the face was still there, but had become flat and featureless again. "Let's get out of here," she said suddenly, taking her cart and pushing it towards the door. "But we haven't cleaned the room yet," Loa countered, looking aghast as Maria beat a hasty retreat. Maria took the "Do Not Disturb" sign from behind the door and hung it on the knob. "We can clean tomorrow. No one will bother this room if that sign's on the door." She was glad to see Loa coming behind her, but she glanced back at the face as it regarded her from the doorway. She prayed she would have the strength to turn away tomorrow, but she knew that someday her own face might look down from that same wall. Maybe it wouldn't seem like such a bad idea on that day.
I'm an Uber driver in the Atlanta area. It's a great place to be an Uber driver, and there's always someone who needs a ride somewhere. I spend 6 hours a day in college classes, another 8 sleeping, and the rest of my time shuttling people to and fro around the Atlanta area. I've been doing this for about 3 years, and in that time, I've seen it all. I've had drunken frat boys that threatened to kick my ass when I wouldn't give them a ride. I've had annoying, nagging passengers who've constantly made me want to pull my hair out. I've seen the occasional cheating spouse hoping not to get caught, the local celebrity on their way to an event, the online influencer who thinks they're way more important than their subscriber count would suggest, just to name a few. I've had my fair share of funny moments, too. The man and his potential lover who met his wife on the sidewalk, the 2 ladies deciding to go get a drink after they had thoroughly screamed at him, never gets old. And I've also had some scary times. The lady with the neck wound who nearly bled out in the back of my car after her boyfriend just pushed her in and ran off came to mind, for certain. Despite all my experience, though, this story definitely falls under the weird category. Well, I guess we can upgrade it into the scary category, all told. Any night where I almost lose my life can definitely be called scary. This happened in October, about a week before Halloween. My girlfriend and I live in a duplex near campus. I've lived there for about 4 years, and she's lived there for about 6 months. We were taking a semester off since none of the classes we needed were available in the fall, and on the night in question, I was hurrying to get ready so I could drop her off at the airport before I started working. She was going on a weekend trip to see her parents in Virginia, and I'd have the house to myself all weekend. I was a little skeptical about her destination, but I decided to let her dig her own grave if my suspicions were correct. Maybe it was all the extra time I was spending at home, but I'd started to notice that something was a little off about her lately. She'd been fired from her job recently, and though she kept saying she was going to get another one, I didn't see her making any effort to do so. All she seemed to do was talk to people on Discord. She'd gotten really into this local group, spooky stuff from what I'd seen, and she was constantly chatting and texting with them. I was suspicious, but I wasn't really worried. At that point, I figured the worst she could do was dump me. We chatted on the way to the airport, talking about what she'd do once she got there, and how much she would miss me. She bemoaned how bored she would be at her parents' house, and when we arrived at the airport, she kissed me goodbye and headed into the busy terminal. As she left for her parents' house, or wherever she was going, I decided to get some work in, since I was at the airport anyway. I pulled into the temporary parking area and signed into the Uber app. The airport was usually an excellent place to find fares, and sure enough, someone was trying to get a lift. He wanted to go to a hotel nearby, and after agreeing to the ride, I moved back into the concourse to pick him up. He was a big dude, around 6 feet and muscular. He had a bag, which he put in my trunk, and a smaller bag which he kept on his lap. I asked him where he was going, and he verified the address, so off we went. He was pretty quiet the whole way there. He looked cramped in my back seat, like a sardine in a can, but he took it well. Mostly he just played on his phone, typing away to someone as we rode in silence. That wasn't uncommon, and I honestly preferred clients who weren't chatterboxes. There was nothing worse than trying to hear your GPS over some drunk backseat DJ who wants the aux cord, or some tourist who wants a guided tour of the city as you dodge rush hour traffic. We drove for about 20 minutes before pulling up outside the hotel without much fuss. I told the guy we'd arrived, and he quickly slipped the phone into his carry-on and offered to tip me for arriving so quickly. I said it wasn't necessary, since that sort of thing was usually handled through the app, but he went ahead and slipped a 20 up next to my headrest, and I took it with thanks. Rules or not, money is money. He asked if I'd pop the trunk, and when he had his suitcase, he thanked me and walked towards the front of the building. I was getting ready to check the app for fares in the area when I heard a noise from the back seat. It was that high-pitched ding noise that so many phones use for notifications, and when I looked in the back seat, I realized the guy had forgotten his carry-on. It had slipped into the floorboard, and I could see the black light on his cell phone through the mesh. I dug out the phone and started to reach for the door when my eyes registered what the message on the lock screen had said. A picture of a pretty blonde was next to the message, and she was asking if he'd gotten to the hotel yet. Another popped up to say that she was running a little late, but she'd be there in 5. She couldn't wait to meet everyone, and she was so glad that she had finally done this. And it was about time they all got together, and the picture was of my girlfriend. I just stared at the phone for a few minutes before someone honked at me, and I drove into a parking spot. A cab had just pulled up behind me, and as I parked, I couldn't help but notice when my girlfriend stepped out and walked to the hotel. She still had her suitcase, her furry boots, her parka, the leggings that she had left the house in, and she smiled hugely as she looked at the hotel. She clearly hadn't seen me, which was good because I had about 1,000 questions I would have likely bombarded her with. She was supposed to be on a flight to Virginia, but instead, it looked like she was meeting some random guy from Discord. Was she cheating? Cheating seemed to be the most obvious answer, but why? We'd never had any problems. Our relationship had been smooth since the beginning. Why now was she... The phone dinged as another message popped up, but this one was from a different guy. "How many have arrived?" he asked. My girlfriend responded, "5, master. Damien seems to have lost his phone, but he's here too." I had meant to check for fares in the area, but instead I found myself watching the phone as the messages rolled in. I was in full information gathering mode now, and anything I could come back with would help me in the long run. If this was a misunderstanding or something, I wanted to know before I melted down on my girlfriend. As it stood, though, it was beginning to look very sketchy. I couldn't open the phone, of course. It was one of those fingerprint lock ones that wouldn't open without a password or a fingerprint, and since I knew neither,
All I could do was watch the dialogue boxes come up. The boxes only stayed for a couple of seconds, and often the messages were too long for the boxes to contain the whole thing, so I was forced to read a little at a time. What I read made me think my initial suspicions might be off. At first, it looked like she was meeting people at a hotel for an unspecified event. As I waited, I saw other people approach, their faces matching the images on the app. I was pretty sure that these people were the ones she was waiting for, because their arrival at the desk was followed by confirmation that someone else had arrived. After 8 or 9 of them had gone up, they began talking to the mysterious Master. The more they talked, the more I realized that this wasn't a weird sex thing. The group started talking about the Ascension and the altar site, to which he responded that they would learn more tonight. He asked my girlfriend if the sacrifice was ready, and she informed him that it would be there when the time came. He quoted some verses that sounded pseudo-biblical and referred to them as the Coven several times. The more I read, the more I began to believe that she might be part of a cult instead. I sat outside the hotel for several hours, and as it got dark, he told them that the preparations were taking longer than expected. He told them they should meet him at the altar site and sent directions, which I got about half of. He told them to be there before dark, and like a flock of birds, they came from the hotel and moved towards cars parked in the parking lot. I ducked down, not wanting to be seen, and I watched as she got into a late-model black sedan. The sedan drove away in a convoy of other vehicles, and since I didn't have all the directions, I cranked my car and followed them. As they moved out of town and got onto the highway, I tried not to make it obvious that I was tailing them. The freeway was busy. It's close enough to end-of-day traffic that I can hide in a crowd, but as we left the interstate, it became harder to blend in. As the sun sank, I saw the turnoff for the access road, their cars kicking up dust as they rumbled down the gravel road. I didn't want to lose them, wherever they were going, so I pulled off the road for a few minutes before following. It turned out they were heading for Panola State Park. As I drove down the bumpy outlet road, the sun started to set for real. The trees started leaning in on me like hands in a funhouse, and the road was so narrow that if someone decided to leave, I'd be in for some trouble. The darkness had swallowed my car before I reached the end, and all at once, my headlights created beacons of light in the encroaching blackness. The park was beautiful during the day, but in the late-night shadows, it had a spooky look to it that only wooded areas in fall can pull off. I suddenly had Blair Witch flashbacks as I trumbled through the spooky backdrop. My girlfriend was definitely into some weird stuff here, weirder than even my imagination could have conjured up, and I knew that I needed to get her out of there before things got bad. When I reached the end of the outlet road, I found a dark parking lot with several cars in it. It must have been a campground at one point or another. I could see a bathroom and a picnic area off the parking lot, and the lot was flanked with lights that no longer seemed to work. I turned off my lights and got out of my car, but when no one immediately came out to get me, I figured they had moved on. I snuck around the building, and sure enough, they were bathrooms. One was a men's room, and one was a women's room. Both were unlocked, but the doors had that broken-into look. Someone had set up a couple of tents in the shadowy space between the building and the forest, but so far I'd seen no one. As I took a step towards the tents, however, a bright light sprang up to my left, and I saw a large bonfire crackling in the woods. It was off to the side of the campground, and for a moment, the sudden flash left me glare-blind. When hands caught me under my arms and dragged me forward, I was momentarily unable to fight back. By the time my eyes adjusted to the sudden flare of the lights, I was already close enough to feel the bonfire's heat and hear the chanting of those around it. It had been low at first, but now it had reached a fever pitch as they drew me closer to the fire. I struggled, but the two men who had me were much bigger than I was. I was pretty sure that one of them was the fare I'd had earlier, and we came up just short of walking into the fire. A robed man in a lacquered mask stepped up and raised his hand for silence, the chanting tapering off as they turned towards me. We stood in silence for 30 seconds before the masked man spoke. Unlike the muscle-bound guys holding me, the guy was not on speaking terms with physical exercise. His robes bulged in front, and had I not been suspended between two men, he would have still been a head shorter than me.
When he spoke, though, it was apparent that he had power here. This one must be Master. As I told you, as Sister Serenity said, the sacrifice has arrived. Another robed figure moved away from the group and stood beside the fat-robed man. She was about my height and had shoulder-length blonde hair. When I met her gaze, I realized it was my girlfriend. I wondered why I didn't recognize her at first, but it became apparent almost immediately. In the firelight, her hair was a frizzy mess as opposed to the straight and silky curtain she almost always kept it in. She looked almost feral as she stared at me, and I didn't see any of her usual warmth there. All of her love or happiness was gone, and she looked at me as though I were meat, like I was something that would bring her joy once I was cooked black and offered on a plate. I was put on my knees before her, and the fat man handed her a silver knife that he drew out of a scabbard like a magic trick. She looked at the knife like she'd never seen one before, and as she returned to reality, she approached me with the blade. I finally realized what I should have seen from the beginning. I was the sacrifice. He'd left the phone in my car on purpose, and even though there was no way she could have known that he'd get in my car, somehow she had. She'd meant for me to be here, for me to be her sacrifice. And as she raised the knife, I had to know why. "Why did you do this? I thought you loved me," I said, sounding pathetic, but still dying to know what this was all about. She looked at me, surprised, before saying, "Because it's why I got with you in the first place. There's always a sacrifice before the coming of winter. The Green Man requires a gift, and it was my turn this year. I had to have someone to give to the fire, and you were there to fill the role." And with that, she raised the knife, and I closed my eyes as I prepared for the strike. When the bullhorn sounded, it scared me just as much as it scared them. "Drop the knife and put your hands in the air. You're all under arrest for—" "Hey, don't move or we'll—" But it was too late. The knife clattered to the ground next to my head, and they all scattered like quail. I was dumped, face first to the ground, unceremoniously, as my two captors beat feet for the woods. The sounds of shouts and boots and the occasional gunshot surrounded me, and I lay still as I hoped not to be shot out of hand. Eventually a pair of boots came into my peripheral vision, and my hands were jerked back into flex cuffs as I was lifted up so the officers could have a look at me. A half hour later, and I'm in a detective's office with a warm cup of coffee and a recently freed wrist. We've been tracking these guys for years. They come to Atlanta the most often of any of their other haunts, and it leads me to believe that most of them are from here. About once every 3 years, we find a body at the state park. They take their organs, scribble some runes on the Vic, and just leave them there. Usually the animals have found them before we do. You're actually the first victim we've managed to find alive. It's a wonder we found you in time. He told me a lot of things that evening. He told me that this Green Man they all worship, some Eastern European god or something, and how they believe that if they don't make a sacrifice, he'll bring terrible fury down upon them. They always make a sacrifice right before Halloween, and it's always some random person they've probably known for less than a year. I gave him my girlfriend's name and the name of the guy from the airport, but he told me neither one checked out. Both were likely fake names, used to cover their tracks. Despite messaging my girlfriend, all I've received is a notice that the number has been canceled. So that's where I stand now. I'm afraid to go home because she has a house key. I'm afraid to go to my parents' house because she's met them. I don't know who to talk to, where to turn, or how many of our friends are involved in this little cult too. The detective told me to be very careful after all, because while they didn't catch my girlfriend, they did catch somebody. He took me to a little room with a one-way mirror in it and had me identify a pudgy guy in a robe. He was talking to another detective in a very animated way, the man staying calm despite the amount of flailing he was doing. He asked if this was the guy that my girlfriend had been talking to, the one they called Master, and I nodded. The man suddenly leaned forward and yelled at the detective, who sat back quickly despite the man's hands being chained to the table. Spit flew from his mouth as he yelled, even through the glass. I could hear what he was screaming. "You don't get it. You idiots just don't get it. We aren't worshiping the Green Man. We're all here to protect you from him. If this false sacrifice isn't received, then he will come. He'll come and he will kill. You have to release me. The sacrifice must be completed." That was about the time 2 other officers ran in and restrained him, but his message was clear enough. If anyone reading this has any information, I'd suggest you go to the police.
These Green Man guys will have to strike again soon. If they believe that their actions keep us safe, if their delusion is something that must be accomplished, then any one of you may be in danger. I was groomed for 6 months, kept safe like a pig for the slaughter, but they don't have time to be so choosy anymore. The Green Man must be appeased, and soon, lest we suffer his wrath. Who knows which one of you might find yourself beside the fire this year?